Hello, and welcome to Dead Ideas in Teaching and Learning, a higher education podcast from the Center for Teaching and Learning at Columbia University. I'm Amanda Irvin, the Center's Executive Director. In this podcast series, we explore dead ideas in teaching and learning, beliefs that, despite being untrue, continue to shape educational systems and practices. These outdated notions, as Diane Pike described, perpetuate the tyranny of dead ideas. Join us as we challenge these misconceptions and explore innovative approaches to higher education. Welcome, everyone. I'm speaking today with Dr. Gene Flenady and Dr. Rob Sparrow. Gene is a lecturer in philosophy at Monash University. His research concerns the structure and social conditions of human rational agency, mobilizing the resources of German idealism and the critical social theory tradition to normatively assess the implications of new technologies for meaningful work and tertiary pedagogy. Rob is professor in the philosophy program and an associate investigator in the Australian Research Council Centre for Excellence for Automated Decision-Making in Society at Monash University, where he works on ethical issues raised by new technologies. He has served as co-chair of the IEEE Technical Committee on Robot Ethics and was one of the founding members of the International Committee for Robot Arms Control. Welcome to our Dead Ideas podcast, Gene and Rob. I am so delighted to be talking with you both today.
Great to be here.
It's a pleasure.
So before I set the stage, a word to our listeners at home. We're going to kick off today's discussion by talking about a recent article that Rob and Gene have published. And the title is Cut the BS, Why GenAI Systems Are Neither Collaborator Nor Tutor, except they spell out BS, and we'll likely say it while we're talking because it's a term they invoke academically, complete with footnotes. So if you have little ears around and you want to keep listening, now is your chance to put on some headphones. Okay, here we go. Rob and Gene, you have a recent article, which I understand is part of a larger work, titled Cut the Bullshit, Why GenAI Systems Are Neither Collaborator Nor Tutor, where you make some strong pedagogical arguments for why AI shouldn't and can't replace humans in this capacity. And I will confess that I am always relieved when I come across these reminders that as humans, we are still relevant. But more to the point of our Dead Ideas podcast, your article cuts to the heart of a lot of dead ideas that resurface when we have big technological revolutions in higher education. And there are many of them, but they all tend to fall into this category of what I've been thinking of, like, is this the end? And news sources plaster digital front pages with articles asking if humans will be replaced by technology. But it seems like the two of you are, if you'll allow me this, calling bullshit. And that is not the case, that there are some things that only humans can do in this capacity. So maybe as a way of jumping in and getting us started, I will ask the question on everyone's mind, why bullshit? I'd never read an article with an academic citation for bullshit before, so can we talk about it?
So bullshit's become a technical term in philosophy, strangely enough, thanks to it's a 1986 essay and then later a book by Harry Frankfurt. He's a rather famous US philosopher. He sadly died last year. He was, I think, professor emeritus at Princeton at the end of his career. And it was Rob that drew my attention to the connection between Frankfurt's definition of bullshit and generative AI. The basic idea is that bullshit is speech that's not oriented to the truth, but just to provoking a reaction. So if you think about the bullshitters that you know, and you probably know a few, they just want you to agree with them or to disagree with someone else. They want you to vote a certain way, perhaps. They just don't care about the truth. And we want to say that generative AI systems like ChatGPT, they're the most extreme form of this. Right? They just can't care about the truth. So for human beings, we might sometimes care about the truth and other times act as bullshitters in our lesser moments. But ChatGPT, is never concerned with the truth. And there's a couple of reasons for this. The first is they don't have access to the world. They just have access to the words in their training data. So people who run this will say they're trained on form. So they're trained just on the way that words tend to line up, not on the content or the meaning of the words. And secondly, they don't have intentions. They're not intending to state what is true of the world. They just predict the next most likely word in a sentence. And they get better at doing so the more that users consider their response human-like. So they're just designed to provoke the reaction from a human being, like, well, that sounded like a human. That sounded good. And they're not concerned with the truth at all.
You know, I'm thinking now about the AI systems that I've used, and you can adjust the temperature, right? To like make it so that how likely an AI system is to want to please you or not, but you can't adjust the truth. You can't adjust the accuracy in the same way. Or maybe there's a correlation there that I don't understand because I'm outside of my field. But that's so fascinating.
So there are systems that are, for instance, only trained on referee sources. I mean, notoriously, lots of these systems are just trained on big tech companies have hoovered up everything they could find on the internet, legal or not, and then trained their models on all of that data. There are systems now that are trained only on referee journal papers, and they will tend to be more accurate, but they still don't care about the truth. They don't care about anything at all. They're not sentient. They don't have feelings or emotions. And they're not really oriented towards the truth. Again, they're trained by people clicking little thumbs up buttons when they say something that we judge to be accurate. So all of the orientation towards the truth is in the human beings. The machine is just a bullshit machine through and through.
When I think about the tutors or the collaborators I've had over my life, a shared orientation to a truth or success, certainly. They have cared about me. They have wanted me to find a stronger truth as I move forward. So this is a way of leading me into a question that I have been thinking about ever since I read your article, which is that you make very strong arguments for why generative AI systems aren't student collaborators or tutors. And maybe I just shared some of them too, but could you share some of these with our listeners at home? Why aren't they collaborators or tutors?
Yeah, so the key linking idea here, at least in this paper, is responsibility. So ChatGPT just can't be held responsible for what it says. And in that way, it's worse than a human bullshitter. You know, there's at least a chance with a human bullshitter that, this is the whole point of Frankfurt's book, right? That he's trying to give you a philosophical analysis of what bullshit is so that we can build the confidence to call BS. And there's at least a chance with a human bullshitter that they own up and take responsibility. But ChatGPT just can't take responsibility for its actions. It just makes no sense to censure it or to punish it. It doesn't care what it says, and for that reason, it doesn't care what we say about it, despite making a show to the contrary, right? It's always pretending like it cares about our feedback, but it just doesn't care. So it's just a constitutively irresponsible agent. And if you think about it, and you're alluding to this, Amanda, teaching and collaborating are all about mutual responsibility. That's the whole, as a teacher, I've got responsibility. Rob and I are both teachers. You have a responsibility to your students. You've got to listen attentively and encourage their participation in class. You've got to read their work carefully. That's your responsibility to them. They've got responsibilities to you. They've got to hold you and your claims to account. You've got to hold their claims to account. And really, in the humanities, that might be what the humanities is about. Learning how to vindicate your knowledge claims and critically assess the claims of others. What AI does is introduce an agent that just can't be held accountable for what it says. A bullshitter that we can't meaningfully call bullshit on. That's why I don't think it's either a tutor or a collaborator. And what really frustrates me, I've got to say, because more and more I'm reading the pedagogical literature, there's so much work done on, feedback between teacher and student as this dialogical, co-constructive process. It's about building trust, sharing vulnerability, all that sort of stuff. And then people who are, gung-ho for introduction of AI into education are just so happy to throw all that research out and say, hey, go with the chatbot, who can't participate in those relationships. So that's what really strikes me about the kind of turn in higher education literature to the embrace of this technology. It's kind of against the kind of best findings and the best research in the field on teacher-student relations.
That's an excellent point. One of the things that really stuck with me when I was reading this argument in your article is that, generative AI can't be held responsible for its output, right? It's not human. And that we can't, because I see a lot of students then have to assume responsibility for AI output if they are going to use AI generated content in their work or as like, a collaborator or as a tutor. And that's inappropriate to ask students to do because they don't have an expert understanding. They're novices, and we're asking them to evaluate what has, to your earlier point, sounds amazing, but isn't true, that much of it is bullshit, and that students aren't equipped yet in a field to evaluate whether or not something is or isn't bullshit. And that really stuck with me when we think, to your point, about the sort of pedagogical force of like wanting to set students up for success. Like when we ask them to do this, we maybe don't set them up for success in all of the ways that we would be hoping.
Amanda, can I just call you on a philosophical point there in that brief discussion, which is we would insist that it's all bullshit. Bullshit is not just the false claims that are bullshit. And, there is that use of the word bullshit where someone may say some true things and some false things. You say the false things are bullshit. The nature of bullshit, as Frankfurt describes it, in the sense we're using it, is because the machines don't care about the truth because they're not oriented towards the truth. It's all bullshit. Some of what they say might nonetheless be accurate. And if a human being said it, you would welcome it. But even when they say things that turn out to be true, even if everything that they happen to say is true, it's still bullshit because they don't care about the truth. And you see this sometimes with human bullshitters. If what they want to do is get a rise out of you, that kind of, the bullshitter at a party who's just trying to kind of create a scene or, make someone angry, sometimes everything they say is true. But the point is they're not saying it because it's true. They're saying it because they want to get a rise out of you.
Yeah.
They want to make you angry. And so they're not oriented towards the truth. And so in that sense, we would insist that everything that the AI generates is bullshit. What the students can't do is work out which bits of it are true or might be useful if a human being were to say them. And that's typically because they haven't learnt those skills. Or sometimes people are asking machines to do things that human beings simply cannot do. Lots of the case for AI is precisely, I heard a doctor the other day say the medical literature is too big nowadays. We can't keep up. But there's this wonderful machine which will read all the literature for you and then tell you, whether this is a good drug to prescribe to your patient. And if you think about that, what they've asked the machine to do is something that they've just admitted they couldn't do. So how are they going to check it? And often our students are in a similar situation. They are using AI precisely because they cannot do some task, or at least they're worried about their capacity to complete some task. But then, having used AI to generate a result, we turn around and say, okay, now it's time for you to take responsibility. You should check. And that puts students in an impossible position.
Yeah, thank you for that clarification. This is so fascinating because it's making me think about other pedagogical moves. Is this idea of like the example that you gave of someone at a party who everything that they might be saying is true, but they're only saying it to get a rise out of you, or they're not invested in the truth or in connection or understanding, which are things that we often, when we set discussion guidelines or community agreements in a class, like these are the skills that we're hoping to teach students, right? To communicate, to understand, to bridge differences, to, like listen, to understand and not to debate or argue, to not be bullshitters. But thank you for that. It's a salient example that makes me think about some other pedagogical implications. So I have a question. I have many questions, obviously. If AI is not good as tutors or collaborators, right? Can we imagine, and this is an honest question, can we imagine any ways that AI might be useful in a teaching and learning setting?
Yeah, so this is one thing that we're both grappling with, right? Because, hear arguments like, and good arguments, that you can't stop them from using this technology, right? And so it needs to be integrated. An argument that we often hear in Australia, I'm sure it's in the US, students need to learn how to use this technology because otherwise they'll be at a disadvantage in the workforce. And that's something that, these are Rob's ideas, really, I just agree with them. In order to use AI responsibly in a discipline or in a particular industry, you have to know the core skills and core concepts in that discipline or industry, right? So this idea that, okay, we've got to sort of not hollow out, well, I worry that it's hollowing out, but we've got to introduce AI into disciplinary specific classes, into philosophy classes, into history classes, sociology classes, medicine classes, and so on. I'm not so sure about it, because to use AI effectively in the workplace, you've got to have those disciplinary skills. You've got to have those concepts down, right? So, Rob's idea, I like this one, is that, yeah, we need to have how-to classes on AI, but they're taught as a part of a generalist skills component, not taking time away from learning core concepts and skills in disciplines. Because, like, let's be honest, right? Getting AI to write for you or to read for you is dead easy, right? This idea that there's some art to prompting, it just blows my mind. Like, particularly for Gen Z, like digital natives, they can learn how to get outputs out of AI, a 2-hour seminar, a few test runs, a few back and forth, change the temperature a little bit. There you go. It's not worth 3 years of someone's time. And if we reduce a history degree or a humanities degree to the art of prompting, just might as well pack up shop, because there's no art to it.
Amanda, so I think AI is actually quite useful, but I think it's really dangerous at universities in pedagogical contexts, because, as Gene's just been saying, the first thing one needs to learn is the core skills of the discipline. So, for instance, I'm very keen that my students learn how to read critically, write well, express themselves precisely. And the only way you can do those things is read, write, and express yourself. And if you get a machine to read the book for you, and you go into the class with an AI generated summary, you are simply not learning the skill. I think part of the problem here is that people who have learnt to read, write, and think critically can look at the outputs of AI and assess them. So having been skilled up through a sort of classical education from a sort of liberal university, you are then in a position to make some conscious choices about the way you relate to AI and whether or not you should endorse its outputs in a particular context. But that's because you already know how to do it yourself. Even there is a danger of becoming de-skilled by ceasing to practice. But for a student, if they come into university and the first thing that they are shown is not how to construct a sentence themselves, but how to prompt a machine to write a sentence, and then they have to think, is that what I meant? But you don't know what you mean until you've learnt how to express yourself in words. So that they do seem to me radically de-skilling when we're teaching. And so I suspect that the good uses are actually, in research where people are already skilled, or in the workforce where people have skill. But in the classroom, I think there's not many good uses. I'm especially skeptical about the idea that our students should study the outputs of AI. There was this great enthusiasm, we'll get the students to read the work of AI. If you want to criticize them writing, there's, hundreds, thousands of years of human writing, some good, some bad. You can learn those skills by reading the classics, not some bullshit churned out by a machine that got switched on yesterday. So I think we need to actually, invest in our disciplines and teaching students core skills. And I think once they have those skills, they will find good uses for AI.
Thank you. And this idea of having a pre-academic year, pre-semester, like skill building for students around AI that is maybe not in a disciplinary context, but rather in a here's how AI works, here's how we might use it, or here's how you might use it. That's really interesting.
So there are some precedents here. Obviously, computers came to universities and everyone got terribly excited And, do we teach students how to use computers in class, or do we say, okay, look, you need to learn some computer skills, go and do a computer literacy course and come back once you can use the computer? There was a time when we had to teach students about how to evaluate sources on the internet, but that didn't mean that we all started studying the internet. There's a generation of students for whom essay mills were a thing where, and there's a sense in which you might say to students, the future of work is collaboration. It's important to know that you can pay someone else to do this. You can subcontract, pay someone else to do this work for you. But nobody thinks it's a good idea that we have all our students pay someone else to write their papers and then submit those as their work. So people need to, see this stuff for what it is, which is, an infrastructure or a technology. It's not the content that we should be teaching students.
Yeah, it reminds me so much of Wikipedia, honestly. When Wikipedia came onto the scene, it was like no one knows who's writing it. No one knows where the source, like it was before Wikipedia sort of built up a more rigorous documentation session. But when it first came onto the internet, everyone was like, nothing is cited. And it, on the one hand, felt like this very interesting, the word I want to say is democratization of information. But on the other hand, this idea of like being able to cite your sources and know where the information was coming from and responsibility, like that was, if anybody could write a Wikipedia entry, how do you know? And that, I'm not equating AI with Wikipedia just to get that straight. But that also was one of these, Rob, like you're saying, like these big moments in higher ed when we're like, will it change everything? And you know what? Things will change. I think this conversation 20 years from now, let's all get back together in 20 years and see where we landed. Because I think it'll be so interesting.
Yeah, I mean, we do talk about technological change and the utopian and dystopian responses to, but I mean, when Wikipedia came out, it's like, well, why would anyone get a university degree when all the information's there? And, it's the same thing. So now that you've got a chatbot, you can just buy the chatbot from Microsoft. Why would you? Because what universities are doing, if they're doing their job well, it's a human-to-human relationship, right? That determines whether or not you're actually in control of, or whether or not you're progressing. Let's not talk about control, whether or not you're progressing in a discipline, right? You need to have your learning verified by another learner. And it's usually by a teacher who's just a learner who's been learning for longer than you. And to me, that relationship between teacher and student, between two learners, that discussion across a material, it just can't be replaced. It wasn't replaced by Wikipedia. And if we're serious about education, it won't be replaced by AI.
No, I cannot think of a better place for us to end our discussion today. Learning is relational. And I have so much enjoyed our conversation between we three humans here trying to sort this out. Rob and Gene, thank you so much for your time today and being part of our 10th season of Dead Ideas. It has been a true pleasure.
Thank you, Amanda.
Thanks.
If you've enjoyed this podcast, please review our website where you can find any resources mentioned in this episode, ctl.columbia.edu/podcast. Please like us, rate us, and review us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. Dead Ideas is produced by Stephanie Ogden, Lauren Close, Michael Brown, and Sarah Carswell. Our theme music is In the Lab by Immersive Music.